While many details remains to be negotiated, the fund is expected to see developing countries, particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of the climate crisis, supported for losses arising from droughts, floods, rising seas and other disasters that are attributed to climate change. While the negotiated text recognized the need for financial support from a variety of sources, no decisions have been made on who should pay into the fund, where this money will come from, and which countries will benefit. This issue has been one of the most contentious on the negotiating table. So, as you see, well, of course, there is a need for the funding, because the people, the society which is more vulnerable to droughts, to floods, and to rising ocean levels, they are going to face the consequences first. Okay, but funding, if it has to be arranged, who is going to pay for it and who are the beneficiaries, that is still under discussion, and still not has been finalized, right? So that this is one of the a very challenging issues, right? Even though we are all aware of the criticality of the situation, but it takes a lot of effort to bring it to the final results with contribution from participating countries and nations. Adapting to the climate crisis, which could require everything from building sea walls to creating drought resistant crops, could cost developing countries anywhere from $160 to $340 billion annually by 2030. You see this humongous figure. That number could swell to as much as $565 billion by 2050 if climate change accelerates, found UN Environment Program UNEP's 2022 Adaptation Gap Report. So the report which we have discussed earlier, if you go into detail, this has found this funding requirement may further bloat to a very big figure if climate change accelerates. Okay, so we must actually put brakes on this a catalytic a phenomena which is giving rise to multiple consequences to the planet. This COP has taken an important step towards justice, said UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres on Sunday. Yeah, so in his remarks, with so much of effort and so much of things coming into what is the need and what are the solutions. Okay, so coming down to all of these, if you see, this is a humongous a task, of course, involving a huge budget, but this is an essential thing because it is related to everyone, right? Some may face it first, but nobody is going to get spared from the consequences of the climate change. While many praised the creation of the fund, many also worried not enough was done at COP27, held in the Egyptian resort town of Sharm el-Sheikh, to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions responsible for the climate change. Here is a closer look. Okay, so well, a lot is being done, but it may not be totally sufficient, and the time it is going to take is often a very important this thing, right? So time, if you see, if we are able to catch up with this a change in a long time, okay, by that time a lot of consequences will already be there on the planet, right? So how the the whole planet is going to cope up if you are not able to catch the horse from a front. Okay, so that is the catch a situation. Countries repeated the phase down of coal phrase featured in last year's agreement at COP26 in Glasgow. While the final text does promote renewables, it also highlights low emission energy, which critics say refers to natural gas, still a source of GHG emissions. Well, of course, but it's choosing the lesser evil. So gradually, I'm sure most of these hydrocarbon based things will be phased out, but unless we reach that day, at least some of those which are having a very high GHG emission rate must be discarded first, gradually moving on to the lower ones and up to the very minimal ones, right? So that is the approach. Yeah, so there were continued concerns about rising emissions. So the key result of the climate COP is the final agreement, which is deliberated by delegates from almost 200 countries. This is usually the focus of intense negotiations, and this year was no exception, with talks lasting until Sunday morning. The final agreement did mention the urgent need for deep, rapid and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. The most ambitious goal of the Paris Agreement. Yet there was concerns that no real progress was made on raising ambition or cutting fossil fuel emissions since COP26. That was considered bad news for a rapidly warming world. All of this is being done is really appreciable, but yes, this concern is also valid. Since COP26 to the recent COP27, if there was no much progress done in terms of cutting, these emissions, then this is really worrisome. Emissions Gap Report 2022 released by UNEP just before COP27 painted a bleak picture, finding that without rapid societal transformation, there is no credible pathway to a 1.5 degrees future. For each fraction of a degree that temperature rise, storms, droughts and other extreme weather events become more severe. Climate finance was front and center. So, climate finance was, as expected, a key part of COP27. The final agreement highlights that $4 to 6 trillion a year needs to be invested in renewable energy until 2030, including investments in technology and infrastructure to allow us to reach net zero emissions by 2050. So, you see this figure, if you want to go for renewable energies, systems by year 2030, a humongous figure, $4 to 6 trillion dollars, a year, per year needs to be invested, if we want, to reach net zero, a situation, by 2050. Okay, this is the figure what you see. So it's definitely a huge figure, and how this will be arranged, who is going to pay for it, is really a a big a question. States are turning more to technology. Two UN bodies, the Technology Executive Committee and Climate Technology Center and Network, announced plans to accelerate the deployment of transformative technologies to counter the climate crisis. The UN Secretary General unveiled a $3.1 billion plan to ensure everyone on the planet is protected by early warning systems in the next 5 years. Okay, so whenever disasters actually struck, whether it is like a fire, or maybe like a tsunami, or maybe like an earthquake, right? These actually do not come with the like a warnings, right? So how are you how the society is going to cope up is really like a big challenge. Okay, so for that, different agencies, like a scientists, they have developed like early warning systems. So deployment of these, of course, is going to take another like a big like amount. So you see $3.1 billion were ensured by UN Secretary General that in the next 5 years these early warning systems will be placed in place, right? So this is also an like a very big feat. Methane emissions are in the crosshairs. UNEP announced the launch of a new satellite-based system designed to detect methane emissions, a potent greenhouse gas. Experts have long said that massive amounts of the gas routinely escape from oil and gas installations around the world. Colorless and odorless, methane is responsible for more than 25% of the global warming the Earth is experiencing today. UNEP will use the satellite detection to notify governments and companies of methane leaks, helping them to take action. So, if I go backward, UNEP is using technology to detect, from which part and in what ratio this, like emissions are coming. These leaks are happening, but particularly for like this gas methane. Methane, you may be like aware of, is one of the like major greenhouse, like a gases, which absorbs and retains heat, right? And it releases, like that heat gradually. Okay. and it has property that it kind of like makes like wherever it is that environment like a hotter, warmer, right? So a huge accumulation of this gas in our atmosphere is leading to the like huge heat retention, which is gradually actually heating the whole planet, right? So of that, if you see 25% like of global warming is because of like this methane, and methane is an odorless like a colorless gas. Okay, so you don't even see, you don't even feel it, right? You need like a help of technology, right, to check where is it like coming from. Like for example, in case of like a LPG gas, like you may be aware, there is a like a different compound which is added to the like a LPG gas, so that whenever there is like a leak, it gets noticed, right? Because it is highly volatile, right? So it needs to be checked, otherwise like the place is going to catch fire, you won't even come to know, right? So this like a gas also is a colorless and odorless like a gas, which needs to be only like checked by like a equipment, right? So satellite imagery like a UNEP has planned to check that at global level and remind like these to the governments and companies and whatever like those agents are to manage it properly, right? So this is the situation related to like a methane. Donors offered support for adaptation. An array of states, regional governments, and development agencies pledged $230 million to the Adaptation Fund to help vulnerable communities around the world adapt to climate change. Governments also made incremental progress on the global goal on adaptation, a pivotal part of the Paris Agreement designed to help countries contend with the fallout from the climate crisis. Those discussions are expected to conclude at COP28 next year in UAE, United Arab Emirates, when this COP28 will be held, in the year like this year 2023, towards mainly towards the end of the year. Reviving damaged ecosystems featured prominently. The Global Peatlands Assessment was launched by UNEP in Sharm el-Sheikh, the first comprehensive global assessment of peatlands in almost 15 years. The report highlights the importance of peatlands to both biodiversity and sequestering carbon. It found that the world loses 5 lakhs hectares of peatlands a year, while already drained and degraded peatlands contribute around 4% of annual global human-induced greenhouse gas emissions. Well, young people were in the spotlight at COP27. Let's see this. A pavilion at COP27 was devoted to children and youth for the first time, underlining that younger generations will suffer the most from the climate crisis. The conference also featured the first youth-led climate forum, which included several senior policymakers. In the closing agreement, delegates urged countries to appoint young people to the negotiating teams for future climate talks, which is a very good initiative, because today's youth is more sensitive, more aware, and more concerned about like such issues, and they are raising their voices. So they must actually get like a place on the international forums, even if it is like this sensitive and this serious, like like a United Nations and its activities and UNEP's activities, right, and COPs, right? So youth actually must like get like their place, so that they can voice their opinion. And one very valid reason that this generation is going to be on this planet for a longer period of time, and they are going to suffer perhaps the most. Okay, so why not to include them? Leaders were pressed to do more, right? So you may have actually like witnessed some like a weird like a behavior from the previous like like a governments, like like such international forums. Some of them, they pulled out of like such treaties, negotiation tables, and things like that. Well, that actually brings everyone in a mess, because they also cannot say that they can evade the repercussions of climate change. So better to like sit together and do this like agreements in a cohesive manner. So in this particular COP, like leaders were pressed, these foreign like national leaders, they were pressed to do more, because somewhere like they still the message is going that it is still not being like handled with the seriousness the way it should be. Okay, we saw after COP26 to 27, you know, like this journey this year, you know, there is not much, you know, which has been done. Okay, so who is responsible for this? Who is accountable for this? Of course, you know, like for that, leaders are the, you know, kind of you know, major change bearers, you know, major, you know, like agents of bringing change at national and international level. So of course, it becomes, you know, like obvious to, you know, like a you know, like a bring them forcefully to the, you know, like a discussion table and press them, you know, for taking you know, corrective measures. Hanging over COP27 was the specter that despite decades of meetings and landmark accords like the Paris Agreement, the world was still not doing enough to slow the climate crisis. UNEP's Emission Gaps Report 2022 found that policies currently in place point to a 2.8 degrees temperature rise by the end of the century, a number that could lead to catastrophic consequences for the planet. Full implementation of the latest pledges to reduce greenhouse gases could slow this increase to 1.8 to 2.1 degrees centigrade. But the report does not find a credible pathway for the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. For many in Egypt, that data underscored the need to ramp up climate action. As the world looks to step up efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions, efforts that are still not anywhere strong enough, it must also dramatically up its game to adapt to climate change, said Inger Anderson, Executive Director of UNEP. So you see, like how the efforts, you know, which are already in place are not enough to bring, you know, like these, you know, temperature rising in the, you know, like a desirable limit. Even not here 1.8 to 2. You know, like a 1. It is somewhere close to 2.8, you know, which is almost double, you know, to the, you know, like a main target, right? And this carries, you know, like a huge potential for bringing catastrophic, you know, like a disturbances, right? So why not to press them? So definitely it's a very justified, you know, like a thing, you know, to press every, you know, like a stakeholder who is having, you know, like a some position to play some role, you know, in bringing this situation to a desirable one. So let's see 5 key takeaways from COP27. First one, establishing a dedicated fund for loss and damage. COP27 closed with a breakthrough agreement to provide loss and damage funding for vulnerable countries hit hard by floods, droughts, and other climate disasters. This was widely lauded as an historic decision. Why? Because for the first time, countries recognized the need for finance to respond to loss and damage associated with the catastrophic effects of climate change and agreed to the establishing of a fund and the necessary funding arrangements. Although the details will need to be hammered out over the coming year, who should pay into the fund, where this money will come from, and which countries will benefit, it's an important step towards justice, said the UN Secretary General. A transitional committee will make recommendations on how to operationalize both the new funding arrangements and the fund for consideration and adoption as COP28 next year. The first meeting, that means, you know, like a year 2023. The first meeting of the transitional committee is expected to take place before the end of March 2023. This outcome moves us forward, said Simon Steele, UN Climate Change Executive Secretary. We have determined a way forward on a decades-long conversation on funding for loss and damage, deliberating over how we address the impacts on communities whose lives and livelihoods have been ruined by the very worst impacts of climate change. Second key takeaway, maintaining a clear intention to keep 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach. The world is in a critical decade for climate action. This is not hyperbole. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says limiting warming to around 1.5 degrees centigrade requires global greenhouse gas emissions to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced by 43% by 2030. That's 7 short years from now, right? Not very far. However, the world is currently off course to keep 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach. A stark report from UN Climate Change shows implementation of current pledges by national governments puts the world on track for a 2.5 degrees centigrade warmer world by the end of the century. Okay. So this is the severity. Key takeaway, like a third, holding businesses and institutions to account. This new phase of implementation also means a new focus on accountability when it comes to the commitments made by sectors, businesses, and institutions. There is absolutely no point putting ourselves through all that we have just gone through if we are going to participate in an exercise of collective amnesia. The moment of the cameras move on, said Steele, who promised a new focus on accountability during his opening speech at 27. The transparency of commitments from businesses and institutions will be a priority of UN climate change in 2023. The UN Secretary General asked UN Climate Change to come up with a plan early next year on how to ensure transparency and accountability with non-state actors. Key takeaway fourth, mobilizing more financial support for developing countries. Finance is at the heart of all that the world is doing to combat climate change. Mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, climate technology, all of it requires sufficient funds to function properly and to yield the desired results. On this crucial topic, COP27 created a pathway to align the broader finance flows towards low emissions and climate resilient development. The COP27 cover decision, known as the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, highlights that a global transformation to a low carbon economy is expected to require investments of at least 4 to 6 trillion US dollars a year. Delivering such funding will require a swift and comprehensive transformation of the financial system and its structures and processes, engaging governments, central banks, commercial banks, institutional investors, and other financial actors. One of the key outcomes of the various decisions on climate finance is a call for developed country parties to provide resources for the second replenishment of the Green Climate Fund. All countries welcomed the recent pledges made to the Adaptation Fund, totaling US $211.58 million. The least developed countries fund totaling $70.6 million and the Special Climate Change Fund totaling $35 million. At COP27, deliberations continued on setting a new collective quantified goal on climate finance in 2024, taking into account the needs and priorities of developing countries. However, serious concern was expressed that the goal of developed countries parties to mobilize jointly US $100 billion per year by 2020 has not yet been met, with developed countries urged to meet the goal and multilateral development banks and international financial institutions called on to mobilize climate finance. UN Climate Change's Standing Committee on Finance was requested to prepare a report on doubling adaptation finance for consideration at COP28 next year, as well as the biennial progress report on the US $100 billion goal starting 2024. Key takeaway fifth, making the pivot toward implementation. Of course, climate pledges are not worth the paper they are written on if they are not taken off the page and turned into the concrete action. That's why COP27 was expected to be one of the implementation. On the opening day of the conference, UN Climate Exchange Executive Secretary Simon Steele called for aligning every corner of human activity with the 1.5 degrees centigrade goal, saying Paris gave us the agreement, Kyoto and Glasgow gave us the plan, Sharm el-Sheikh shifts us to implementation. So COP27 was like a majorly focused towards implementation. But what does a shift to implementation mean and what will it look like? For starters, the package of decisions adopted at COP27 have a strong focus on implementation. They aim to strengthen action by countries to cut greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the inevitable impacts of climate change, as well as boost the support for finance, technology and capacity building needed by developing countries. Notably, nations resolved to make the transition to low emissions and climate resilient development ambitious, just and equitable. They want one step further at COP27 by deciding to establish a work program on just transition, which is expected to build on and complement the work to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation. The Paris Agreement calls on signatories to take into account the imperatives of just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. That means a just transition is not a fixed set of rules, but a vision and a process based on dialogue and an agenda shared by workers, industry and governments that need to be negotiated and implemented in their geographical, political, cultural and social context, according to the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Speaking about the year ahead, Steele said that UN climate change will help parties and future COP presidencies navigate this path to the new phase of implementation. The heart of implementation is everybody, everywhere in the world, every single day, doing everything they possibly can to address the climate crisis. So you can understand the urgency of it, how urgent and how critical, like this is. With this, we have come to the end of this module. Well, COP27 concludes with a historic decision to establish and operationalize a loss and damage fund. Together, let's not relent in the fight for climate justice and climate ambition, said the Secretary General in his closing message. Well, UN Chief said, we can and must win this battle for our lives. Okay. If we want to live, we must fight to stop this climate change. With this, we have come to the end of this, like a module. Briefly, I'll explain you the document which was released, COP27 as a declaration. Yeah, so this is this, like a document which is the revised advanced version which was released, at the time of COP27. So you can see it here. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, Conference of the Parties, 27th session, Sharm el-Sheikh, 6 to 18 November 2022. Agenda item 2, organizational matters. So here, proposal by the President, draft decision. Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. Okay, so that is the like an important thing. What the document we are seeing here, talks about this. The Conference of the Parties recalls decisions of the previous ones. Okay, noting decisions when so guided by science and principles, reaffirming the outcomes of all previous conferences of the parties, serving in the meeting of parties of the Kyoto Protocol, etc. Also reaffirming the critical role of multilateralism based on United Nations values and principles, noting the importance of transition to sustainable lifestyles and sustainable patterns of consumption and production for efforts to address climate change. Also noting the importance of pursuing an approach to education that promotes a shift in lifestyles while fostering patterns of development and sustainability based on care, community and cooperation. Acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the rights to clean, healthy and sustainable environment, the right to health, the right of indigenous people, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development as well as gender equality, empowerment of women and intergenerational equity. Noting the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, etc., emphasizing that enhanced effective climate action should be implemented, recognizing the fundamental priority of safeguarding food security and ending hunger, etc., also recognizing the critical role of protecting, conserving and restoring water systems, etc., underlines the urgent need to address in a comprehensive and synergetic manner the interlinked global crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss in the broader context of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Acknowledges that the impacts of climate change exacerbates the global energy and food crisis and vice versa, particularly in developing countries. Stresses that the increasingly complex and challenging global geopolitical situation and its impact on the energy, food and economic situations, as well as the additional challenges associated with the socio-economic recovery from the coronavirus pandemic should not be used as a pretext for backtracking, backsliding and deprioritizing climate action. Well, the section 1, science and urgency, welcomes the contributions of the working group 2 and 3 to the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, recognizes the importance of the best available science for effective climate action and policy making, takes note of the 2022 adaptation gap and emissions gap, reiterates that the impacts of climate change will be much lower at the temperature increase of 1.5 degrees centigrade, recognizes the impact of climate change on the cryosphere and the need for further understanding of these impacts, including the tipping points. Section 2. Enhancing ambition and implementation. Resolves to implement ambitions and expresses appreciation to the heads of states and governments. In energy, emphasizes the urgent need for immediate, deep, rapid and sustained reductions in the global greenhouse gas emissions by the parties. Recognizes that the unprecedented global energy crisis underlines the urgency to rapidly transform energy systems. Stresses the importance of enhancing a clean energy mix. And on mitigation, recognizes that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade requires rapid, deep and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions. For adaptation, section 5th, notes with serious concern the existing gap between current levels of adaptation and levels needed to respond to the adverse effects of climate change. Urges parties to adopt a transformational approach. Also urges developed country parties to urgently and significantly scale up their provisions of climate finance. Highlights the role of the least developed countries fund. Emphasizes the importance of protecting, conserving and restoring water and water related ecosystems, etc. Loss and damage. Noting with grave concern, according to information in the contribution of Working Group 2 and 3 to the 6th Assessment Report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the growing gravity, scope and frequency in all regions of loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change, resulting in devastating economic and non-economic losses. Expresses deep concern regarding significant financial cost associated, welcomes the considerations for the first time of matters related to funding arrangements, further welcomes the adoption of decision COP27 and CMA4 establishing the institutional arrangements of the Santiago Network for averting, minimizing and addressing loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change. Next section, early warning and systematic observation, emphasizes the need to address existing gaps in global climate observing system. Welcomes and reiterates the United Nations Secretary General's call made on World Meteorological Day on 23rd March 2022. Next section, for implementation, pathways to just transition, affirms that sustainable and just solutions to the climate crisis must be founded on meaningful and effective social dialogue. Emphasizes that just and equitable transition encompasses pathways that include energy, socio-economic, workforce and other dimensions. Finance highlights that about $4 trillion per year need to be invested in renewable energy up until 2030 to be able to reach net zero emission by 2050. Also highlights that delivering such funding will require a transformation of financial system. Notes with concern the growing gap between the needs of developing countries parties. Expresses serious concern that the goal of developed countries parties to mobilize jointly $100 billion per year by 2020. Emphasizes that accelerated financial support for developing countries from developed countries and other sources is critical. Notes that global climate finance flows are small related to the overall needs of developing countries. Urges developed country parties to provide enhanced support, including through financial resources, technology transfer, capacity building, etc. Calls on the shareholders of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions to reform multilateral development bank practices and priorities. Calls on multilateral development bank to contribute to significantly increase climate ambition using the breadth of their policy and financial instruments. Emphasize the ongoing challenges faced by many developing country parties in assessing climate finance and encourages further efforts. Takes notes of the report on deterioration of the needs of developing country parties related to implementing the Convention and Paris Agreement. Technology transfer and development. This section welcomes with appreciation the first joint work program of the Technology Executive Committee, the Climate Technology Center and Network. Highlights the importance of cooperation on technology development and transfer of innovation in implementing the joint work program's activities. Welcomes the forward-looking conclusions of the subsidiary body of implementation to continue consideration of a Poznan strategic program on technology transfer at its 61st session. Next section, capacity building, notes that capacity gaps and needs still exist in developing countries and calls on developed country parties to increase support for long-term country-driven capacity building interventions. Taking stock, notes the importance of periodic review of a long-term global goal. Ocean welcomes the outcomes of the key messages from the ocean and climate change dialogue. Encourages parties to consider and appropriate ocean-based action. Forest recalls that in the context of the provision of adequate and predictable support to developing country parties, encourages parties to consider and appropriate nature-based solutions. Agriculture welcomes the establishment of the 4-year Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on implementation of climate action on agriculture and food security. Next section, enhancing implementation action by non-party stakeholders. Acknowledges the engagement of non-party stakeholders, right? Recognizes the important role of indigenous people, notes the adaptation of action plan under the Glasgow Work Programme, encourages parties to increase full, meaningful, equal participation of women in climate action, invites parties to provide support to developing countries, recognizes the role of children and youth, expresses its appreciation to the presidency of 27th session, expresses its appreciation to the children and youth constituency, encourages parties and non-party stakeholders to engage actively, welcomes the leadership of presidency of conference of parties and the high-level champions, welcomes the recommendation of the high-level expert group, invites the Secretariat to engage greater responsibility and accountability of voluntary initiatives, welcomes the convening of 5 regional forums led by the President of 27th session of the Conference of the Parties. So with this, we have come to the end. I would suggest, you to refer this document, online. This is freely available to read and download, and go through this in detail. This will help you understanding, the action plans and the implementation strategies, adopted by COP27. With this, we have come to the end of this module. Thank you all for joining. See you in the next one.